these three themes because, in my mind at least, they are all very closely connected. Let me begin somewhere that you might not expect me to begin, namely, not with the violent crime part and not with the representative government part, which I touched upon this morning, but with the religion part. Now, I feel a little bit emboldened to do this today because Justice Antonin Scalia, apparently the other day, Nino to his friends, did this, and it created quite a splash and quite a story, including on the front page of the Washington Post. Apparently, what Supreme Court Justice Scalia said was that he was a Christian. He believed in Almighty God. As a Christian, he believed in the resurrection of Jesus Christ, and he frankly thought it was his constitutional right, even as a Supreme Court Justice, to say so. Now, why that ought to be particularly controversial, I'm not sure. He didn't go on to say that he would now, henceforth, ignore law and precedent and rule accordingly, according to his lights as a practicing Christian. But it did create quite a stir in Washington. In fact, according to some of my colleagues at the Brookings Institution the other day, the air literally went out of the Beltway following Justice Scalia's remarks. And I want to begin, so feeling emboldened by Justice Scalia, I want to begin there too. The week before last was for many Americans, indeed for many people all over the world, the holiest week of the year, the week of Easter, the week of Passover. And I happen to be a Roman Catholic. One of the things about being a Roman Catholic raised in Philadelphia in the 1960s and 1970s is you don't choose your faith. Your faith chooses you. And the good sisters of the Immaculate Heart choose you. And by the time you're 8 or 9, if you've been listening, they've got you. And they got me. And of course, I went through the usual business, at least the usual for many people at college, of growing away from my faith. But I've come back to it, came back to it in graduate school, and have been a, quote, practicing Catholic, unquote, for more than the last decade. And I say this because I want to turn into this topic by referring to a piece of Scripture. The week before Easter, as is usual on Palm Sunday, we read in church from the Gospel according to Matthew. And in the Gospel according to Matthew, we read the section dealing with Christ's time on the cross. And in Matthew, so some of you may know, the last words spoken by Christ on the cross are, "My God, why have you forsaken me?" And then the Spirit leaves him. Now that is a troubling passage to some theologians, who instead prefer the account of Christ's time on the cross according to John, wherein Christ's final words are not, "My God, why have you forsaken me?" but instead turns to John, "This is your mother," referring to Mary. "Woman, here is your son," referring to John. "Now it is finished." And the Spirit leaves him. It is a problem, and has troubled some theologians and others, the Matthew account, because it seems as if it could be taken literally as if Christ's final words are, "My God, why have you forsaken me? I am forsaken." Not another earthly word. As such, the mortal Christ, the mortal body of Christ hanging on the cross, not the Spirit spoken. I've always liked Matthew because, to me, the challenge of Matthew is, have we been forsaken? It's up to us to decide whether we have forsaken the Word and the message. And as I reflected on that passage in church on Palm Sunday, it occurred to me that if we were to ask in this society today, which members of our society would have the greatest justification, the greatest right, to cast their eyes to heaven and say, my God, why have you forsaken me?" It would be the children who are growing up today in America's most depressed, drug and crime-ravaged inner cities. Now, I'm not going to go through statistics with you. I'm not going to recite all of the empirical data to you. I'm sure that you know it as well as I do, and I'd be glad to discuss it or refer to it or do a literature review for you in question and answer if that comes up. But we all know what we're talking about here. We are talking about a group of children who are growing up in places, in many cases without either father or mother, no adult in their lives to show unconditional love or anything that resembles unconditional love. You don't have to be anything or do anything. I'm here to love you. Don't know that experience. Don't know that sentiment. There aren't parents. There aren't coaches. There aren't teachers. There aren't clergy in the lives of these children. And over the horizon, there aren't decent high schools or jobs or opportunities. I've described these children in some recent writings as fatherless, godless, and jobless. But in some ways, that is an overly optimistic description of their lives. Because it's not merely the absence of an adult, any adult in their lives, to provide consistent and loving discipline, to protect and guide them. It's not merely the fact that the churches in their neighborhoods are boarded up or closed or unable to serve or minister to all their needs. And it's not merely the fact that they're living in relative economic poverty. It is the spiritual depression that occurs in the life of a child when you grow up in a world where all you've really known is severe abuse or neglect. And for many of these children, that is literally, and I mean literally, not figuratively, but literally all they have known. They have never known a relationship with another human being or set of human beings senior to them in years, which has not at some level been a relationship of abuse or neglect. These are the forsaken children of inner city America. These are the children who live in the areas where we have deconcentrated employment, deconcentrated opportunity, deconcentrated even civil institutions. It's not merely the flight of manufacturing. It's not merely the flight of business. It's the flight of civil institutions, families, decent schools, churches. All of that is gone too. I had the equivalent, I guess, of what some people would call an epiphany of some kind. One day, several years ago, I used to do work in a number of go in and out of juvenile institutions, and I was at one point a consultant to the New York City Board of Corrections, which oversees the Rikers Island jail operation and so on. And one day I was looking at the manifest, the visitor's manifest, in one of the juvenile lockups. And the manifest covered a 2-day period, 36-hour period to be precise. And that manifest, that visitor's manifest, was a blank sheet of paper. There was not a single name on that manifest, i.e., not a single adult, a mother, a father, a teacher, a neighbor, a friend, a guardian, a probation officer. No one had come to visit to see what was happening with these kids. Now, I submit to you, not as a matter of faith or religious belief or even moral responsibility. I submit to you as a matter of hard-nosed empirical analysis and reality, that you can take all of the aforementioned studies and statistics and Head Start and Big Brother, Big Sisters of America and every other program in which we have good evaluation research. And I submit to you that if you were forced honestly to characterize the difference between those programs which do and do not work with at-risk children, the euphemism we use, at-risk children, at risk because unloved, unparented, uncared for, forgotten. The difference, the key mediating variable, is the density of caring adults in the lives of these children. Now, we know from over a generation's worth of research, some of it recently seized upon by a number of excellent criminologists like Professor Frank Cullen and others, we know that even if you look at a population of kids who are at risk, who have all of these life-threatening, debilities, difficulties, and so on. We know that somehow, some way, even with the most extremely at-risk children, about half of those children over time will somehow find their way. And the other half will get into trouble with the law, do serious crimes, be chronically jobless, have miserable existences, and make others miserable too, in some cases, and destroy what little remains of the social fabric of their communities, and deal drugs, and commit predatory street crimes, and so on. We have no idea, however, if we're to be honest, what really explains, at either the macro level or the micro level, these differences. We have no idea. None. I've talked to people who have spent most of their adult careers doing big-time public policy, demonstration research on community and youth development programs, on work-to-welfare programs, and so on. They have their hunches. They have their ideas. They have their hypotheses. But no one really knows. No one really knows. And it's hard to even figure out, as I had an enjoyable time with some of the graduate students here today over lunch, it's hard to even know where you would begin to try to figure out how to discover what's going on, what explains the difference. And then if you could figure it out, if you could generalize about the conditions that produce half the kids being okay, those extremely at risk, and half not, it's not clear that you would know or be able to foster those conditions in a predictable and desirable way. You might get the answer, but it might be irrelevant in policy terms, or in pragmatic, do something about it terms, more fundamentally. And so, what I would like to suggest to you, and what ties the pieces of this topic together for me, is that we ought to take our bearings. We ought to look to the people in these communities, first and foremost, and maybe first and last, for the answer to the question, what works and what doesn't. And rather than waiting for the nth generation of research grants and research findings and academic debates and conference funding, we ought to take their best guess and their best prudential experiences as our guide in structuring a set of programmatic activities that might make a difference and that, in their opinion, have made all the difference. Now, there are many people who live in the places I'm talking about. And one could look in many different places for advice and counsel. One could look to the social service delivery workers. One could look to the people in the justice system, including local police precincts. One could look to public school teachers. The people whom over the last year or so I've chosen to look to, with whom I've interacted, and for whom I now feel like I'm working full time. It's amazing what happens when you get infected with this sort of thing, are inner city African American ministers. And I will telegraph my punchline to you now in saying that their goal, the goal of this group of 50 or 60 extremely dedicated, where the rubber meets the road, no nonsense, tough love, get the job done, problem-oriented inner city ministers, their hope, their goal is to organize over the next 5 to 10 years 1,000 inner city churches, 50 in each of the 20 largest cities, to help take back the streets, take care of the babies, mend the lives of those adults in these neighborhoods whose lives are not whole, make a difference in the careers and the lives of people who are struggling and are on the border of making it, interface with people in government agencies who can help to make a difference. And I believe as a matter of faith, and I believe as a matter of analysis as well, that they can make a significant difference. Solve the problem, no. Turn the tide, no. Make a difference, yes. But make a difference with respect to what in particular? Well, with respect to, I believe, lots and lots of different things, including, and not least of all, the problem of violent crime. Violent crime, as you know, is down, has been going down the last few years nationally. It's down by a lot in New York. It's down in Houston. It's down in many other cities. But as you also understand, we have every reason to keep the champagne corked, too. Because murder, rape, robbery, assault, and other such crimes, even though we've had a little decrease in some cities and a big decrease in New York, Houston, and a few other places, the fact is the streets remain much less safe in these places today, and much, much less safe in the most depressed inner-city neighborhoods of these places today than they did in the 1950s and 1960s. Yes, we're doing better relative to what we were doing better in the aggregate a few years ago. No, we're not doing better in absolute terms, and sure as anything, we're not doing well at all in the places where most of the people in this room, if you live or have lived in or live in now or around big, you know where the bad neighborhoods, you drive around them, you avoid them, you tell your kids not to go into them. We all know what we're talking about. And in those places, things aren't better. Moreover, I will not retract this morning's talk and say the future of American corrections, oh, it doesn't matter after all, or that policing policies don't matter, or that other law enforcement policies don't matter. But we all know that at the end of the day, the criminal justice system is not the determining factor in what happens with crime rates, juvenile delinquency, and violent crime rates, and so on. We all know that ultimately we're dealing with simple demographics, in particular the number of at-risk males and how at-risk those at-risk males are. We know that by the year 2010, the year I spoke about as my endpoint year this morning, there will be about 4.5 million more males in the population aged 17 or under than there were in 1990, roughly 8 or 9% more whites, roughly 25% more blacks. We know from the criminology of the subject that around 6% of young males turn out to be some type of career criminals, and that this increase, if you follow this bouncing ball along with the 4.5 million increase in the male cohort, would put an estimated 270,000 more young predators on the streets than in 1990, coming at us in waves over the next 2 decades. Now, one can get very fancy with these estimations. One can do fancy demographic models. One can employ different numbers and different estimates of what it means to be at risk. One can hope for sunshine. One can assume a can opener, or assume better families, or assume continued federal funding, or assume lots of things. But I think it's reasonable, it is not by any means unreasonable, to suppose that we are going to have more kids in general, more young males in particular, and especially more young inner-city minority males who are going to be more at risk than ever before, have more difficulties, less social support, and greater burdens and stresses placed on them even than we had in the 1970s and 80s on kids from these places. The second reason to keep the champagne corked on violent crime, of course, is that not only is the number of young males going to surge and at-risk males going to surge, but we all know that we're talking about race here. And if we deny that we're talking about race, we might as well stop the conversation. You know it, I know it, we all know that for many black Americans, this discussion is ultimately about a criminal justice system which they believe, based on their own personal experiences in many cases, the experiences of Professor William Julius Wilson, perhaps the world's most renowned urban sociologist, driving through a New England town and committing the offense he refers to as DWB, driving while black. We know this happens in America. We know the experiences of my students at Princeton, some of whom are black, walking through Nassau Street, doing absolutely nothing other than trying to get away from me, probably, and being hassled by cops. We know this goes on. I knew it went on growing up in Philadelphia, standing at a street corner at 6 o'clock in the morning, a bus on the way to high school, largely surrounded by young black males. I knew when that police officer drove by in that cruiser in Philadelphia in the 1970s, he was looking out for me, not for them. We all know this. And so we know that whatever the statistics say, and I am one who believes firmly, strongly, I've written about this, I don't think the empirical evidence as such tells us that there are significant racial disparities in the sentencing process or in the justice system. I don't believe most police officers are racist, or most white police officers are racist. I don't believe the sentencing system systematically discriminates. I don't believe, based on the empirical evidence as I know it, and as I've interpreted it at least, I don't believe, but that does not obviate the lived experience of people. And it could well be the case that both things can be true at once. there's a lot of casual racism and harassment and so on that doesn't happen to translate in a significant enough way to show up in the kinds of studies which have been done on the degree to which the system is at one point or another racially discriminatory. For whites, we all know what we're talking about here too, especially whites who grew up as I did in urban neighborhoods, semi-integrated urban neighborhoods. We know what we're talking about. For many whites, the simple truth is this. You walk down the street, if you see a young black male coming toward you at 10:30 at night in DuPont Circle of Boston, if that young man is not wearing a tie or in handcuffs, you assume you've got trouble. Now that is the reality. That is the reality. There is fear. There is loathing. And that fear and loathing complicate tremendously this debate and this discussion. But they complicate it in ways that I think can be addressed if we go back to the real root causes of the problem with which we're dealing. And the real root cause, I submit to you, is not economic poverty per se, but what I've characterized in some recent writings as moral or spiritual poverty. In the neighborhood where I grew up, white, ethnic, blue-collar, working class, in the 1960s and 1970s, that neighborhood has changed. A higher fraction of boys growing up in that neighborhood get in trouble with the law. More young girls become pregnant without the benefit of marriage. There are more James Q. Wilson, George Kelling broken windows, more minor disorders, more graffiti. Why? Because more of the kids in that neighborhood are growing up without the benefit of adults in their lives who care, who are there, who show concern, who monitor, who discipline, who love. Period. It's not a race thing. And what is true in Southwest Philadelphia's downwardly mobile white working class neighborhoods is also true in North Philadelphia's predominantly black, poor inner city neighborhoods, where the out-of-wedlock birth rate is not 25%, as it now is in parts of Southwest Philadelphia, but closer to 65 and 70%. Where the rate of joblessness is not what it is in this neighborhood where I grew up now that the Philadelphia Navy Yard is closed, and I keep waiting for Robert Reich's job retraining programs, you know, but I just don't see them coming. Where joblessness is the norm. Where violent crime is the norm. Where many kids take it as usual, as standard, to have to be afraid to walk from their house to their local school. This problem of moral poverty, if we're willing to understand it as such, comes in every race, creed, and zip code. It is not about race. It is not even about class. It is about what it takes, based on all we know from science and all we know from common sense and experience, to raise children to adulthood in a way that keeps them whole, keeps them sane, keeps them striving, keeps them caring about what happens to them. And the problem we have now in the juvenile justice system with respect to violent crime is that many kids simply don't care. They don't care about the future because they don't see one. They don't care about other adults because no one, or other human beings, because no one, frankly, has shown them any care or concern. Nonetheless, even if we agree to focus on the problem in a way that transcends race, transcends class, transcends all the usual explanations, and even in a sense transcends ideology, if we choose to view it as a problem of a failure of adults, responsible adults, caring adults, white, black, or brown, to intervene in the lives of these kids, even if we agree on that, we still cannot easily get beyond the fact that the bulk of the violent crime problem increase and the juvenile violent crime increase problem is a problem that is concentrated in the inner cities, among, in particular, in black neighborhoods in big cities. What are we to do about this? What are we to say about it? In my view, it is a waste of time, and it is almost, I think, a public disservice to continue to have debates about whether, if we have a, quote, disproportionate number of African Americans in prison, America is a racist, oppressive society. It always has been. It always, assume that's true. Take that as a given. Assume that's true. Assume there's something in the air supply or the water supply. Assume we can't transcend this history, this legacy of slavery and Jim Crow and legalized discrimination, and so on. Assume that's true. What then? What then? Sentencing Project, one of my fan clubs, tells us that 1 in 3 black males in their 20s, ages 20 to 29, is now under some form of correctional supervision. And they're right. As I said this morning, I think it'll be closer to 50% for that group in 5 to 10 years. And furthermore, it's already at 50% in Washington, D.C. and some other major urban areas. What now? What now? Which 911 calls from Southeast Washington or North Philadelphia or South Central L.A. or Detroit are the police to ignore? We don't enforce the drug laws in your community because it's 1 in 3. Which Washington monument-sized fallacies should we take up first? Should it be the one about, well, 70% of these people who are incarcerated are there because of a racist war on drugs? Fine. Decarcerate 70% of all males, black males in prison. Decarcerate them, all those who have committed drug crimes. You still don't get a racially proportionate prison population because there are roughly 8 times as many whites as blacks in the population. In fact, for 1991, in order to get an 8-to-1 white to black ratio in prison, you would have to release all but 45,000 of the 372,000 black men in prison. Now, who put these folks in prison? Almost without exception, with respect to most of the violent crimes, you're talking about black victims, black neighborhoods trying to protect themselves and law-abiding citizens and their loved ones. This is an issue of profound controversy in which people's emotions are profoundly ambivalent, profoundly complicated. What I am suggesting to you is that the usual responses that are being made in parts of the academic or quasi-academic community are unproductive, counterproductive. We're debating questions of racial proportionality and injustice, which are largely beside the point at this stage of the game, because we have a large generation of young children, black and white, in the big cities, who are most definitely going to be a lost generation unless we get focused on the problem of getting adults in their lives now. Fine, let's have these debates next week, or next year, or next month. But somebody's got to pick up these babies, because there is nobody home. You hear these reports about Child Protective Services, threefold increase in the number of kids who were reported to Child Protective Services agencies since 1985. Where are they coming from? Who are these children? What happens to them in the foster care, bureaucratic, social services, family court, juvenile justice complex? You know, and I know, that what happens to them is they get passed from hand to hand. We can't do better than that? We can't structure a system that is more effective than that one in laying hands on these babies, these young children, these 4 to 7-year-olds who are at risk, who a decade from now either will be the 14 to 17-year-olds whom we fear, or the 14 to 17-year-olds for whom we have high aspirations. Hence religion. Hence religion. Here, Robert Woodson, leader of the National Center for Neighborhood Enterprise, a black man, a veteran of the civil rights movement, and an organizer of community and faith-based groups that reach poor blacks and their children. Woodson speaks of white racism when appropriate, but he also speaks of moral vagrants in the inner-city communities who prey upon their disadvantaged neighbors. Here, John W. Gillis, another prominent African-American male, who heads California's parole board and is a member of the Council on Crime in America, on which I serve. On the day the Council's first report was released to the press, John Gillis stared into the cameras and implored responsible journalists to remember who it is who normally puts black convicted criminals in prison and why. black victims, black witnesses, and black communities in order to do justice and to protect themselves from murder, mayhem, and deadly drug dealing. Here, the grief-stricken family of Philadelphia police officer Loretha Baird, the city's first female cop and first black woman to be killed in the line of duty. Officer Baird was murdered in cold blood, execution style. Two of her three alleged killers were 26-year-old local gangster rappers who apparently practiced the hate that they hummed. Baird's family members are calling for justice, life in prison, or the electric chair for the killers. The citizens of Philadelphia, every race, every neighborhood, join them, majorities, in that call. Here, Deborah Dickerson, the self-described liberal sister of a young black man paralyzed from the waist down in a drive-by shooting. Read her intensely gripping, highly personal essay published in January in the New Republic magazine under the heading, "Who Shot Johnny?" Therein, she rages at the black assailant who shot her brother and left him for dead. His crime? Waving hello at a car full of boys whom he mistakenly thought he knew. The assailant stood over his bleeding body, barely conscious body, and said, "Bet you won't be doing no more waving now, you MFer." And the attacker was never caught. Here, Harvard law professor Randall Kennedy, who in a 1994 Wall Street Journal op-ed described as dangerous the response that cries racism as part of an all-out defense of any black accused of wrongdoing by white authorities, regardless of the facts of the case, and as troubling the position of some that they will refuse to help send any black male to prison. Here, the Reverend Jesse Jackson. For over a decade, no black national leader has argued more eloquently against policies that offer black Americans jails instead of jobs. And none was quicker to make hay of the Sentencing Project's 1 and 3 finding. But recall Reverend Jackson's own tortured words on November 27, 1993. Quote, "There is nothing more painful for me at this stage of my life than to walk down the street and hear footsteps and start to think about robbery and then look around and see it's somebody white and feel relieved. How humiliating." What I'm suggesting to you today is, above all, hear the voice of the black inner city ministry, a voice which has not been adequately heard and a voice which has not been adequately tested over the last 15 years as these problems have led to civil society's ruin. Hear the Reverend Eugene Rivers of Boston, the individual in this community with whom I have worked the closest and for whom I have the greatest respect. In the 1960s, Reverend Rivers was himself a member of one of Philadelphia's most violent black street gangs, the Somerville Gang. Then the Reverend Ben Smith, who was a living legend in the city of brotherly love, set Eugene Rivers on the right path. As the Harvard-educated Rivers preaches, and I quote him, "For the people of God, every crisis, no matter how grim, presents a unique opportunity that can only be seen with the eyes of faith." And he goes on to explain how, in Boston, black, Roman Catholic, and Jewish clergy have come together by faith to develop concrete strategies for reducing crime and violence among black youth. In particular, under Reverend Rivers' leadership since 1988, dozens of black churches in Boston have begun moving together to look after abused and neglected inner-city children, to stand up to drug dealers and gangsters, to spark local business development, and to reclaim the streets and end the terrors. They are doing it, not talking it, but walking it and living it. Reverend Rivers, his wife, and his two young children live in the Four Corners neighborhood of Dorchester, one of Boston's most violence-torn neighborhoods. In 1991, 3 bullets from a gang shootout flew into Rivers' home over the bed of his 3-year-old son. In 1993, Reverend Rivers grabbed a local crack merchant by the collar and told him not to deal anymore at the local playground, which the community had spent painstaking time rehabilitating and building up and making a habitable public space. Quoting Reverend Rivers now, he said, quote, "I told him, brother, I'll get you a job, I'll get you up for college, the whole 9 yards. He told me to kiss his ass. So I did like I promised. I busted him. Called the cops and probation and said, come get him now. They did. Well, a week later, back on the streets and out for revenge, this kid drove by Rivers' house at 2 a.m. and pumped it full of gunfire. Fortunately, no one was hurt. As Reverend Rivers recalled, quote, "The question from all the hoodlums in the neighborhood after that was, is the minister going to cut and run? How's he going to treat this boy?" Reverend Rivers didn't cut and run. He stayed. He reformed. He took under his wing. He testified in favor of the kid who shot up his home. He branched out, developing alliances with other churches, setting up neighborhood crime watch programs, and developing a host of practical, tough love programs, including adopting a gang for evangelistic outreach, and commissioning missionaries, as they think of and call themselves, to go to court with juveniles, to make sure that the kids get a fair shake, and that they comply, once the disposition is rendered, with the court's requirements. Rivers and his small but talented and dedicated volunteers work closely with city officials, the local police, the Catholic Church, the schools, and just about everyone else who can make a positive difference in the lives of the kids he's trying to save. Reverend Rivers is interesting, and I think I use him and his story here to illustrate the point, because there is no one, absolutely no one in America, I think, who is less romantic about the capacity of inner-city churches to single-handedly leverage this problem and make things better. He understands that there must be help from all sorts of quarters. He does not believe this can be done if the federal government pulls the rug out from under support for aid to families with dependent children. And so he opposes, as I do, strongly radical welfare cuts and family caps. He understands that since half of all Medicaid recipients are children, even though they consume only 15% of the Medicaid dollars, that we must preserve this piece of the federal social safety net, lest these children fall prey, even not have access to basic health care. No one is more realistic, I think, than Reverend Rivers, the people he works with in Boston, and the coalition of ministers around the country who have come together in this 1,000 churches movement. No one is more realistic about the church's dwindling congregations. They're often near empty coffers. And the negative attraction that many of these churches have, these Christian churches have, to today's young black males who live in these neighborhoods. And yet, at the same time, no one, I think, understands better that when you get right down to it, what we are talking about here is the need for a resurrection of the civil society of inner-city neighborhoods, and that the black inner-city churches are the one and only institutions that can do this. A moral problem, a spiritual problem, and a problem of economic development all at once. A problem of a deficit of conscience, of values, of connectedness, political connectedness, moral connectedness, spiritual connectedness, requires a moral solution, and only a moral institution that comes out of the black community, such as the black church, can bring to bear the moral authority to solve it. Quoting Reverend Rivers again, quote, "It's barbed wire and more black juvenile super predators, or civil society and stronger black churches. It's that simple." I believe that it is almost that simple. I further believe that the issue of church-state relations, the constitutional quandaries, the difficulties here, can be addressed in a forthright way. We're not talking here about organizing 1,000 churches and trying to be one nation under HUD. We're talking about organizing 1,000 churches and being one nation under God. We're talking about Reverend Rivers and the people with whom he works and the people around the country issuing a call to all of us, but a call in particular to the 75% of African Americans who live in metropolitan areas, who do, like most Americans, live in suburban neighborhoods on the metropolitan periphery. A call for volunteers, a call for hands-on, a call for grandparents. And in Boston, this call has been heeded. And miracles happen. We're not talking about a solution, a silver bullet, a panacea. We're talking about setting an example of hands-on, community-based, where the rubber meets the road activity. Above all, and in terms of the elite policy discourse, what we're talking about is ending all of the nonsense. Now, I spend probably 2 or 3 days a week inside the Beltway in Washington. So I got nonsense up to here, okay? And let me tell you what kind of nonsense we're talking about. We're talking about the nonsense that says you have to increase welfare spending or we can't do anything, and the nonsense that says if you don't cut or end welfare, we can do nothing. We're talking about the nonsense of word images that talk about people on welfare as if they're criminal offenders. The elision between crime and welfare. We're talking about the distortions about who really receives these benefits and under what conditions. We're talking about redefining the public debate about crime and the inner cities and the relationship between government and religion in a way that calls upon people to view this issue in terms of two axes, not left-right, not good-bad, but two axes. Are you willing to get close to this problem? I mean close to it. Not 30,000 feet, where we all look like ants. But I mean close to this problem. You want to get close to the problem and to the people? A, that's the first axis. Or do you want to keep this at arm's length and talk only about building more prisons and building more jails? Talk only about, in abstract terms, more welfare or less. Talk only in abstract terms about changes in the rate of growth in various budget items. Do you want to get close to this problem or remain distant? And the second axis is, are you willing, whether you're a person of faith or you're an atheist, whether you're somebody who is a person of faith and a Christian or a Jew or a Muslim, are you willing to try faith-based solutions to these social and economic and spiritual ills? If you are in the quadrant of wanting to be close to the problem and willing to try faith-based, church-centered solutions, that is where Reverend Rivers and this movement is, and where I am and hope to remain over the next 10 years, doing whatever I can to assist them. What is heartening, and the good news I have for you, is that a surprising number of policy elites in Washington, Republicans and Democrats and others, have rallied to this call in a way that may or may not be sustainable. People as diverse as Newt Gingrich and Bill Clinton, as Marion Wright Edelman of the Children's Defense Fund on the left, and Arianna Huffington of the Center for Effective Compassion on the right. Institutions as diverse as the Heritage Foundation on the right and the Brookings Institution on the left have come together in saying yes to this civil society-driven, church-based, faith-centered approach to helping to solve these problems. And that is good news. One last set of points, and then I will stop. I do not believe that there is any significant constitutional dilemma posed by this effort. If you look right now, not at what we say we do with respect to church-state, but what we actually do in the administration of existing social services programs, we already do administer them largely through churches. Now, if you take an organization like Catholic Charities of America, 62% of its funding comes from government. Now, Catholic Charities, of course, is very careful to maintain the posture, that all of what they do with that 62% of every dollar they spend each year is purely secular. I mean, faith has nothing. They could be Jiffy Lube. They would do it exactly the same way. If you believe that, I have a bridge in Brooklyn I'd like to sell you. If you look at any social services program of any scale, and you go to any city of any size, you will find that some of the not-for-profit intermediaries are faith-based. And you will further find that the faith spills over. Now, we can argue and say we must maintain a strict separation of church, and there must be a wall of separation between church and state, and then we can get on to a long and complicated and convoluted and unresolvable debate about what the Founding Fathers really said and really meant and really intended vis-a-vis the relationship between government and religion, faith and politics in the public sphere. But I would hope, and I especially would hope that my friends, none of them, I guess I have very few friends out there in the world as the American Civil Liberties Union, but I would hope that my friends of the American Civil Liberties Union would at least draw a single breath before rushing to litigate against what may come out of this effort, and look at what we actually do now, and how these programs, anti-poverty programs, economic redevelopment programs, are already being funded and administered to some extent, and in some cases almost exclusively, through churches. Judge them by results, not necessarily by the process. Finally, since November 1994, to, as it were, pluck the beam from one of my own eyes, I guess, conservatives, especially lots of conservatives who are in Washington, have been talking all sorts of talk about civil society, families and churches and schools and neighborhood groups and so on. Now, however, comes the test. Reverend Rivers, Reverend Smith of Philadelphia, who bought, for those of you who are baseball fans, I can't resist just retelling, bought Connie Mack Stadium, where the Philadelphia Phillies used to play. Bought it, tore it down, and with the dollars and cents from his own congregation of poor folks, built a huge church complex that runs 80 different programs, from prison fellowship to community-based drug treatment to reach out to teen pregnant. I mean, you name it, he does it in that complex. Here are the Reverend Rivers, the Reverend Smiths of inner-city America. They're not out there talking, they're out there doing. And in Smith's case, he's been doing it for over 50 years. And here are textbook examples of self-restraint, of family-centered, church-based, community-strengthening, not a penny from government approaches that are favored by today's leading conservative voices. Here they are. Now comes the test. Put your money where your mouth is. Will the right-wing conservative foundations put up the $150 million that conservatively estimated, in the fiscal, not the ideological sense, will be necessary to get this movement up and running? Will they do it without strings? Will they do it without political justification or exploitation? This is their thing. Government can't do it, right? Can't just be government. It's got to be public-private. It's got to be civil society. It's got to be community-based. It's got to be bootstraps and self-reliant. Here it is. Here's the test. Will they put their money where their mouth? If they don't, you will know for sure they are phonies, they are liars, they are not to be taken seriously. As Reverend Rivers has exhorted, including exhorted groups of the aforementioned conservative elites, we must, quote, together embrace the youth, disciplining our young people and loving them. In particular, he implores Christians to remember that, quote, whatever you do for the least of these children, these brothers and sisters, you do for Jesus. To that I say amen, and I will stop there, Tim. Thank you.
Thank you, John. I would be astonished if there were not some reactions, observations, questions. If it's all right with you, I'll exercise the privilege of the chair and ask the first one.
Okay.
I think if I kept my count correctly, the word school was heard in the last 45 minutes once, and I think I heard it toward the end of the talk. What role do the schools play? If you turn back the clock 25 years ago, improving urban school systems was seen as one of the keys to preventing delinquency and so forth. Where does that fit in?
Well, I could tell you, I'll tell you in two senses where I think it fits in. First, I'll tell you where it fits in programmatically with this 10-point plan that Reverend Rivers and these others have been working in Boston and have been trying to implement and institute other places. And then I'll say a bit about what I think and what I've said and recommended vis-a-vis that particular issue of schools and the role of schools in redeveloping, resurrecting these neighborhoods based on some of the research evidence and some of the practical experience. With respect to the former, schools are a very important component of this 10-point plan, of the so-called 10-point coalition. It is recognized that one of the simple, some of the problems that are most profound here are the problems that are in a, get-it-done sense most simple. There are simply no places for children to go in these neighborhoods when the school doors close. It is not very pleasant to go back into a public housing complex which looks like something that came out of Beirut, okay? And it is just understood that kids learn better, feel better about themselves, and so forth, if they're in an environment where there are more adults who care about them and where they feel safe. And so one of the things the 10-Point Coalition has pushed very hard successfully there are 37, I guess now up to 39 churches directly involved in it, not counting the Catholic churches and others. They have worked very hard, not only with the public schools, but with the Catholic schools, to keep these doors open as safe havens, as well as in drawing on the schools for volunteers. And one of the things to be said here is that even though I may have inadvertently or indirectly slurred the teachers' unions this morning in contrasting the political situation vis-a-vis crime and corrections, it's amazing what people will do when they're asked. It's amazing how people will heed the call. And a lot of the volunteers who have come in and worked with this 10-Point Coalition in Boston and elsewhere have been people who spend all day teaching kids and who worry about them overnight. The kids who come in unfed, the kids who come in dirty clothes, the kids who come in with black eyes. These people, these mere bureaucrats, these overpaid, don't work hard, it's amazing what they'll do when they're asked, and they have. So the schools, the institutions, the physical plan, as well as the sort of human resource base has been a real part of the 10-Point Plan, and it is one of the, in fact, it goes a little, without getting into too much detail, it goes a little beyond that, because another piece of the 10-Point Plan, which I support totally, which some people have found surprising, but I don't know why, they have attempted, and they have successfully in a very few cases to this point, however, but part of the plan is to have in every one of the schools in these neighborhoods where the coalitions operate, to have a African American and Latino history corps. Now, we're not talking about Afrocentric stuff. We're not talking about, sort of the extreme version. We're talking about a program of materials and teaching which says, in effect, even though you may be growing up in an environment where, if you were rational, you would be rational in inferring that you must be at the lowest end of the totem pole here, and no one must love you, and no one must care for you, and you must be a part of a tradition of people who cannot succeed. In fact, you come from a culture of people who have succeeded and do succeed and can succeed. And there's not enough of that in the public schools. And there's not enough of that, to be sure, in some of the Catholic schools where a lot of these children actually do attend school. And so part of the 10-Point Plan is to try to help influence the curricula of these schools so that children do have a real, meaningful understanding of their cultural backgrounds and history and self-worth. And I support that. The second part of the answer is, I think, in some of the writing that James Allen Fox has done on the question of increases in juvenile crime and violent crime, and what he believes, I guess, as I do, although we come at it, I guess, in very different ways with different kinds of data, a bloodbath on the horizon, mixed metaphors. Fox, his number one, we testified in Congress, Reverend Rivers, myself, Professor Fox, testified in the Senate in February, and Professor Fox's number one recommendation to the Senate was, keep those schools open. What happened to the federal support for school safe havens? What happened to sort of that piece of the weed and seed money, and so on? And I support that. I think that makes perfect sense. The difficulty, I think, however, is in trying here, too, to negotiate and anticipate the potential problems with the church-state issues. I mean, in Boston, thus far, it has not been an issue. But again, when the kids go in there in the safe havens, if there's going to be Bible study, there's going to be Bible study. That may be an issue that will get litigated or the people will be upset about. So that is one complicating factor. But that schools must be a part of this, I don't think there's any doubt. That schools can be the engine of it? No. Because ultimately schools have to be schools, have to meet the needs of a diverse range of kids. And in many urban areas, as you know, the population of the schools is not purely local in any case. So, yes to schools.
Do we have other questions or comments?
It's a matter of choice. I think I'd rather have kids learn about the Bible than learning how to make drugs or use drug paraphernalia. I mean, that's a lot more positive. I mean, it's just a matter of choice. I don't see how it could possibly be objective.
Well, Dr. Del Carmen, I'm sure, could give us a lengthy recitation about all the possible objections that have been raised or could be raised, but he says he doesn't want to do that now. He's not working this afternoon. So, but I hear you. Sir?
Would also the debate, John, like center on the idea that for years the government has convinced the public that they have a solution to problem of crime. And instead of maybe secularizing or pointing towards the church for a solution, wouldn't it also be good that people in government begin to tell the public that the money you're going to pay Monday to us is only going to partially solve this problem or help this problem? Should they not start telling the public that we, as the government, do not have the solution to crime, and that we need to rely more on you, the community, whether it be the religious aspects of it or the secular aspects? And I think only when you start having people in government start telling the public that this money you pay April the 15th is not going to solve this problem, that we need your help also and your dollars. Can we begin to address the problem of how the community, whether religious or otherwise, because the numbers are getting to a point, as you pointed out, that we can't deny anymore that it's out of control. The government cannot solve this problem by itself, and its leaders need to tell the public.
I wholeheartedly agree with that, and I think to some extent it's happening in a sort of a backdoor way. I mean, government's job vis-a-vis the violent crime problem, let's say, is really the catcher's mitt job. I mean, it's the last stop, it's the end of the line. If you have people who have already committed predatory crimes against others, if they've violated the life, liberty, or property of others, if they've already done that, they're there, they're doing it. Government is supposed to step up to the plate, get the resources it needs, and take care of that problem, handle these folks in a constitutionally acceptable, humane, but effective way. That's government's job. It's the restraint business at the back end with as much other good stuff as it can do as possible. But at the front end, with respect to, I mean, it is as simple as the old notion of, crime and delinquency and root causes. How do kids become, what is the process by which a kid becomes, that beautiful baby, right, becomes some kind of a predatory street criminal? There, anyone who believes other than parents, families, schools, neighbors, loved ones, relatives are the best anti-crime insurance policies. Anyone who thinks that you can buy more prevention by running some, introducing some wrinkle into the local community-based policing program, you can buy more crime prevention from that than from having better families and better schools and stronger churches, is absolutely either not living on the same planet with the rest of us, not reading the empirical literature, because in particular, and I hadn't mentioned it because I didn't want to, as I said at the beginning, bore you with the statistics, but there are a tremendous number of studies which find, in some cases stumble across, the efficacy of the religion variable, other things being equal, that make a difference, a positive difference in the lives of these kids. It is very hard for public policymakers to make this sort of, confession, because sometimes they're ready to be saying, well, we can't do anything. But I will refer back to this Senate hearing in February, where Senator Biden and Senator Thompson, respectively the Democrats and Republicans on this subcommittee on youth. This was supposed to be, by the way, a subcommittee hearing on the reauthorization of the Juvenile Justice Delinquency Act. It had nothing to do with that whatsoever by the time we got done with them. We had everybody telling their personal stories about their own, backgrounds, which is actually better for a change in Washington. But that hearing was absolutely, both of those senators said, on the record, look, there is very little government in general, the federal government in particular, can do without the aid and support of civil institutions, of families, and so on. This is where it must begin. And Americans have to themselves step up to the plate, be co-producers of justice, take responsibility for their communities and their kids. This is very trite, but oh so true.
I've been struggling with how to frame this question, so pardon me if I'm negatively impressed by a common theme I've heard of from this morning and this afternoon, that you seem very comfortable with your ability and perhaps with the system's ability to distinguish between the rotten apples and those that still have some kind of core that might have hope for them. You seem to characterize the violent predators as its most significant problem that we face as a people. I wonder if your etc., and also generalize to explain the kind of horror that we see corporations, for example, responsible for when they take their jobs to the economically oppressed people and continue oppressing them. Or if you're willing to share, to continue that line of logic to explain the toxic waste dumps that are now growing in our cities, not by the street criminals, but by the chemical manufacturing companies that don't care about the people that they're poisoning. Is it the same loss of hope? Is it the same lack of spiritual commitment that explains their violence that they're all victims of? Or are we only worried about those young black men who are wandering the streets in Philadelphia looking for people to injure?
Well, I don't know. I personally, maybe you would join me in a call for capital execution of people who commit knowingly and willfully the kinds of crimes against persons and communities you referred to. For example, if a person knowingly and willfully, and contrary to federal, state, and local laws, deposits toxic wastes that result in the death of other individuals, I would see those persons get the death penalty. I mean, that would be my, to me, that's an act of murder. If you're talking about, does this mean we ought not to focus on more generally white-collar crimes or corporate greed or even any of the other 7 deadly sins? No, I'm not suggesting that either. What I'm suggesting is that we have a real incumbent problem in inner-city America, that problem is a problem not only of a flight of jobs, but a flight of civil institutions, and that unless we act soon, we will guarantee that more of the kids who are there today will be in these jails or dead 10 to 15 years from now, as night follows day. As regards the ability to distinguish one from the other, I would submit to you that this is very much like an operation of triage. That's really what it comes down to. If we had an infinite supply of resources, human and financial, if we had no budget line, as it were, either in terms of our voluntary commitments or in terms of our willingness to spend public treasury, if that were the case, and if a frog had wings, if that were the case, I would have no problem in joining you or anyone else in a call for expending whatever it took to help resurrect the spiritual life, the wholeness of any individual. And in fact, with respect to prison fellowship and other things, that's exactly what those programs are about. You're talking about people in some cases who are doing life in prison. They're not coming out. And yet, individuals are investing their time, their precious time, and in some cases, governments are investing, taxpayers investing their resources in making whole the lives of people who have left behind them nothing but a long train of abuses and victims. I support those programs. But if you ask me, either as a person of faith, or as a tax-paying citizen, or as a policy analyst, whether I think at the margin we're all better off morally, or spiritually, or economically, or politically, or socially, in spending more resources on people who have already done the crimes, inflicted the harm, succumbed to the temptations, to the blandishments of drugs, than investing in the front end on the children who we know, large fractions of them are going to be lost to the same fate if we don't act now in this creative way, then I would not agree. I would not follow that path. This is a very simple path to follow. It's a very simple path. And it's not about confidence or even overconfidence in distinguishing from the good and the bad. None of these people, none of them, even those who I would argue in favor of execution for, ought to be viewed simply as human refuse. They're individual human beings and moral agents. So I don't accept the general premise that we have to sort of, with respect to this problem, which is a problem of real people in real time in real cities, that our failure to address significantly or well enough other problems should restrain us in any way from forthright action on this one.
The basis of my question suggests that all of the violence perpetrated upon us by corporate America is the product of this loss of faith that you so willingly characterize the urban black.
I will tell you without any hesitation whatsoever, okay, that if you go now to the top Fortune 500 corporations in this country, you will find as much variance in the boardrooms, okay, as you find in the schoolhouses and probably in the churches as well. There are good guys, bad guys, and in between. Corporate America is not monolithically evil. The people of these neighborhoods are not monolithically good or evil. I mean, if you're trying to ask me, do I think that there's a spiritual void in the lives of those who say, gee, let's see, our latest MBA gave us a report saying that we need to downsize by 47,000 jobs. Gee, I guess I should have flown to the Bahamas this weekend. I mean, these people are mere cogs in a machine. As a Catholic, and following not only my own sentiment, but our bishop's latest letter on this subject, no, I can't abide by that. I don't know if I would necessarily want to criminalize that or criminalize the closing of the Philadelphia Naval Yard. I think I might vote Senator Specter out of office as a result, but I don't know if I want to criminalize it. No, I think there is. I don't think it's a problem simply of poor folks or inner city folks or working class folks per se who are under stress and are producing difficulties that go to the failure to socialize adequately people who go on to be our police officers, our corporate board executives, our college professors, or whatever else. I don't think it's a problem that's confined to any one race, class, place. And I also, by the same token, however, don't think that there's no variance in any given class of persons, whether they're corporate board leaders or prison officials or inner city kids who are struggling to get by. Ma'am.
I understand there's a trend downward in organized church religion and membership, and also in service organizations, the kinds of organizations that make people work in the community. Their members are older, and the younger members aren't coming along to take their place. Is this a bad sign?
It is. I mean, to some extent, and of course I didn't get into any of the, I have a sort of front row seat with this business to what I think is going to, I think historians will look back on 25 or 30 or 40 or 50 years from now as sort of it's a social movement. I think we're in this country, we're in the fourth great awakening. Actually, that's not my observation. It's an observation by Nobel Prize winning economist Robert Fogel in a speech he gave last year, where he talked about, sort of looked at the evidence in terms of, and said, this country is in the middle of another great awakening, or fourth great kind of spiritual revival or movement, part of lots of Americans. Now, it is absolutely clear, as you suggest, that in these churches, you're talking about lots of boarded up buildings. You're talking about institutions that have lost credibility with the people of the neighborhoods in many cases. You're talking about institutions that have near empty coffers. You're talking about institutions that have not been able, and Reverend Rivers and others, as I said in my comments, are most realistic. I mean, they are most self-critical. And the whole movement, these many different denominations going through this critical self-examination or re-examination of where we are, how do we get here? How do we go, in this case, the royal we's, the folks in this community talking to each other about the state of black America today? How do we go from 1965, 300 elected officials, 1995, 8,000 elected officials, yet two-thirds of us are doing somewhat better, one-third of us are doing 10 times worse? How did that happen? How did it happen that these institutions of a people that were fundamentally local and spiritually rooted, that these institutions were allowed to atrophy and become enervated in exchange for what? In exchange for the secularization, the nationalization, the bureaucratization of social help? How do we get away from a kind of compassion that's effective in terms of being spiritual and personal and challenging? How did that happen? And the answers, are up in the air. And this is the debate, the dialogue that I see, that I have a front row seat to, going on in this community. And I believe that when it's all said and done, you're going to see lots and lots. You're going to see armies of people coming in from the metropolitan periphery, coming in from within the central cities. Instead of worrying about special services districts to get us away from them, you're going to see more and more people, especially more and more college students. And there's a good sign. This notion that today's college students, and for those of you who are children of the 60s, I apologize, but the notion that today's college students they're just apathetic, they're just greedy, not so. Not so. In fact, I bet you if we had some objective indices, we could tell you they're probably outperformed the flower children in many respects. So they're getting involved in this. And urban universities. University of Pennsylvania is deeply involved in the community issues in West Philadelphia now. People are waking up to this need. And so I understand, and you're right on, that we're right now, right, take a snapshot, we're dealing, the tank is about a quarter full, maybe. But I think that tank's going to, I believe that tank is going to be full next 5 to 10 to 15 years.
problem's not only in the inner city, but it's in the small communities as well. And sometimes I feel like I'm fighting windmills here in town because the kids will say things to me and talk to me, and I'm not the only teacher. But I just wondered, in your infinite wisdom and experience, if you had any names, groups that we could contact. I've talked to a lot of people in town, and it seems to go nowhere. People are into fear. They're afraid they're going to get sued. They're afraid and the kids are the ones that are getting neglected. And I would be, open to any list of information.
I'd be happy to furnish you. Sure, I'd be happy to give you one. And groups like the National Center for Neighborhood Enterprise and lots of others deal with these issues and deal with these complications. I was at a playground with my kids about 3 weeks ago in the neighborhood. And we live in a neighborhood that's sort of right on the border of one of the higher crime neighborhoods of Philadelphia, right? And I'm not, trying to make a statement. I mean, it just so happens it's the playground that's closest to the house, so we go there. And it's not in the best, if I drove farther, I'd get, a more kind of controlled, stable. But we went there. And there were a couple of kids at the playground who were acting out, and I mean acting out big time, not just, aggressive horseplay, but I mean, you just felt at any moment now somebody was going to get seriously hurt. All right? So I went over to the kids and I said, hey guys, just calm it down a little bit, I'll try and have some fun here and so forth. And they did. It was fine. And one woman came up to me about 4 or 5 minutes later and she said, wow, that was really brave what you did. I said to myself, brave? These are, 12, 13-year-old kids, right? I sized them up. I mean, there's an algorithm going. I didn't say, here comes another statistic of the juvenile super predators. He's going to turn around. I mean, if I had thought that and I was alone with my kids, I wouldn't have done it. Okay, but it's amazing how much fear there is, and certainly this issue about lawsuits. I mean, this is parallel. I mean, this is a whole other. This is another. This is something coming public law. It's a whole other issue. But I mean, the problem of people being afraid to interact with their fellow citizens, to pick up a guy who gets hit by a car in the street, another car's coming, and here's his head, and here's the car, and you're right there, and you say, if he dies, it might be my problem. They'll sue me. I mean, people do that. People do that. And there's a bigger. I mean, the related problem here is, what about the difficulty, even if you had the help? How'd you organize it? How would you sustain it? Is the institution you're a part of, your school, going to say, sure, you can have the classroom after hours. Sure, you can have, the blackboard. Sure, you can have. And if they don't, where do you go? Do you do it in your own home? Do you take it? I mean, do you have to be a saint? I mean, do you have to be Mother Teresa in order to solve these? Because if you do, we got a big problem here. I mean, I'm willing to go with Reverend Rivers, but if we all have to be Mother Teresa, I think it's a problem. So, I mean, these are real practical rubber meets the road issues, and there are groups, and I can happy to that have dealt with them and worked through them.
We have to start taking responsibility. I'm a peer and educator with the school district, Margie works with as well. I'm in these homes that you were just talking about, and I see a lot of people just pointing at, like you were saying, the us and them and saying, how can you go into these homes? And these people are treated like monsters, like they're they're subhuman. And that's what we need to start dealing with, the fact that these are just people who are having everyday problems, just like all of us. Their problems might be different, but their problems are problems. And sometimes we do have to be Mother Teresa and say one family at a time, just one person at a time.
Well, there is. Oh, there's definitely light a single candle. I mean, that's definitely a piece of this, but and I agree with you. I mean, the difficulty here is this is a society that, in some sense, has spent 30 to 40 years, depending on who's doing the counting and by what criteria, getting away from the notion that we have collective responsibility and communal responsibility. Everybody looks and says, whose problem is that? If my mother gets sick, I'll tell you right now, my folks live now, we both alive, not doing that well. If my mother needs long-term nursing care of any kind, I am not in a position right now either to figure out the hands-on help that she'll receive, certainly not to fund it myself. So I'm looking to Medicaid. I'd be looking to Medicaid, and I'd be looking to help from people. Now, I don't mean to suggest that 30 years ago there was a utopia, okay? But I can tell you that coming from a family, you know, like lots and like the typical American experience of people who were on relief during the Great Depression. When my grandmother died in 1986, they had to pay back a loan on the house that was still a lien on her house from the Great Depression, from being on relief in the Great Depression, okay? And they had something. They had lots of bad things that we don't have anymore, like institutionalized discrimination and racism, right? But they also had a closeness in the community and a willingness to sort of lend a hand. And in a sense, we have kidded ourselves that it's all been, we've gained everything. You know, we haven't gained everything. We haven't gained everything. And the problem was never really, quote unquote, integration. That was never the problem. You know, the lack of it was a problem of lack of human integration. That's been the problem.
And that's still going on. Still going on.
Perhaps one more question. If I could, maybe I'll bring it back to a more policy wonkish kind of question.
Okay.
What's the role of government in creating legitimate economic opportunities in the city under this scheme?
Under this scheme, what we have to have as a necessary but insufficient condition for anything like this, I mean, if not this, then what? But if not this and other things, government must continue to provide a basic social safety net. Now, I'll be very brief because I know we're at our end, and this is cruel and unusual punishment anyway, to listen to me, some of you, for more than 2-3 hours in one day. Really, you ought to, you'll be rewarded in the hereafter for this. Trust me, I know. There is this notion that the choice we have is between a bureaucratized, centralized national welfare state that gives money to people whether they try to work or not, and that, you know, creates perverse and unintended consequences, and, you know, breeds welfare dependency and so on. And that the alternative is to go back to a system, to the, quote, good old days, unquote, when we had a system of private community-based hospitals, private charities, and community groups, all of which took care of all of these problems. The reality, as I see it, is what happened over the last 30 to 35 years is we went from a decentralized, privatized, civil society-anchored, community-based system and created a hybrid system, okay? The old system worked in some ways, but for many people was literally a killer because lots of people fell between the cracks. It literally failed to get food, medicine, and money to poor people who needed it when they needed it in a predictable and reliable fashion. The new system came along, and it's pretty good at getting resources to people in a predictable fashion. The checks come, the public, you know, the public facility hospital is there, and so forth. The only problem is it's all low end. It does create perverse incentives. And it does have all the warts that the critics say. What we have is this hybrid, quasi-nationalized system that reflects the kind of state-centric, you know, community-based old system as well with this national overlay on top of it. So my sense is that, my hope would be, that we would, through this debate about welfare reform, go sort of take a deep breath and say, look, we have, according to certain criteria, 9 million kids in this country today who absolutely will not make it unless they receive predictable and reliable federal governmental support. It cannot be, you cannot rely on the states to do it, not because the states are mean-spirited, not because of, you know, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, but what about Philadelphia, Mississippi? Not for that reason, and not even because of race to the bottom, but because the states simply do not have, as we speak, anything like the administrative infrastructure or the funding bases to throw off this kind of income and deliver the services in a predictable way. We must keep AFDC. We must keep Medicaid in place, intact, in order for any of this to work. That is the role, so far as I'm concerned, that is the minimalist role the federal government must play for this to work.
What's the role in job creation? Not welfare, but creating legitimate jobs in these communities.
The problem with that, Tim, or the problem with the call for job creation is that, number one, the federal government has an abysmal record of job creation. The federal government, I don't think the federal government has done, I would say this about federal job programs. Those programs have been flawed. Whether they've relied on the development strategy, we, the federal government, are going to bring jobs and industry and decent paying back into communities, where the economic pressures are so profound and powerful to drive them to the metropolitan periphery. Enterprise zones ultimately do not work. Empowerment zones ultimately have not worked. Okay? These development, redevelopment, federal strategies haven't worked, nor have the dispersal strategies worked, which is the federal government saying, we are going to force all these suburban communities to take a certain number of low-income residents. There, it's not the economic pressure, but the political pressure. There's one strategy left, and that's the mobility strategy. Why shouldn't the inner cities of this country be every bit as livable, every bit as viable as any place else in this country? Most people in this room, I will bet you, like most Americans, you live in one place, you work in another, you recreate in a third. My God, if you're in Texas, you better have a car. You're going all over the place, okay? The only people in this society who are not mobile in that way, the only people who we expect to make it somehow without the capacity to be mobile, are people in the inner cities. And then if they can't find jobs or don't move, we say, well, you're lazy, you're this, you're that. The federal government's responsibility is to lower the barriers, okay, the technological barriers, the information barriers, and the transportation barriers to getting the people who have the skills and are willing to work to where the jobs are. And that is where the federal government can do and is doing something. Even in this Congress, $30 million additional dollars are being appropriated through HUD for this Bridges to Work program, which is real, based on really good experience, and I think will make some small difference.
I'd like to make a comment. I'm a college advisor within TDC for junior college. And you know, you talk about jobs. Most of us, unless we're in a situation where we have to gain skills, we're going to go along, we're going to coast along. Put in a situation where we have to get a new job, all of a sudden we panic. We need new skills. I deal with inmates, young and old, who are in a situation that they have to learn, either get GED, there's about 80-85% within TDC to do. Go beyond that, usually remediation, college. This is all under attack, that this benefit of education within TDC is worthy or successful, because who can count success? I too struggle with what all I do doesn't make a difference. I mean, I'm dealing with inmates, and I don't even know what all they're there for, and obviously they try to be there, okay? But I have to look at it that, to me, the only solution there is education, and the broadest sense of the word. If it's drug, alcohol, substance abuse, somehow get help to be able to learn, to get a job, to get the skills. But now it's on the taxpayer. It's state funding. Federal funding is reduced. Now, New York voted out education for incarcerated students. California is going through it. Texas barely saved the program. And here is a large majority of people incarcerated, funding under attack that would help people. It's kind of like throw them away if there's no funding. Now, I don't know what you have on this type of thing. There doesn't seem to be any feedback. Nobody has compiled any data.
Well, I can tell you, all I really have for you is one thing, and that is a 1995 doctoral dissertation by a PhD student in economics at Princeton, who now teaches at Harvard, who found evidence of very positive effects, more positive, I think, than any in the literature, of the efficacy of prison-based education programs in terms of cutting recidivism, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm afraid that's a pretty weak read, but that's all I have. Well,
thanks for that comment. I tend to apply two very simple criteria to these sorts of events. One is that it has to be informative, and I think that both of today's talks were very informative. And secondly, probably more importantly, that it be thought-provoking, and I think that you scored a home run on that as well.
Thank you.
So, John,
thank you very much.
Very much.
Bless you, Tim. Thank you.